The fidelity of Ra towards the attempt to remove distortions was total. This constituted an acceptance of responsibility for service to others, which was of relative purity. The instrument, through which Ra spoke, and its support group had a similar fidelity and, disregarding any inconvenience to self, desire to serve others. Such purity was as a light. This power had the capacity of energizing those which may be available for harvest. Such an intensity of light attracted attention. A negative fifth density entity became aware of the power. The fifth density saw the difficulties posed by the light. This entity was desirous of disabling this power source and had two desires. The first and foremost was to, shall we say, misplace one or more of this group in a negative orientation, so that it might have chosen to be of service along the path of service to self. The objective which had to precede this was the termination of the physical complex viability of one of this group, while the mind-body-spirit complex was within a controllable configuration. It sent its legions. The usual attempts upon positively oriented entities or groups of entities are made by minions of the fifth density Orion leaders. These are fourth density. The normal gambit of such fourth density attack is the tempting of the entity or group of entities away from total polarization towards service to others and toward the aggrandizement of self or of social organizations with which the self identifies. Nearly all positive channels and groups may be lessened in their positivity or rendered quite useless by what we may call the temptations offered by the fourth density negative thought forms. They may suggest many distortions towards specific information, towards the aggrandizement of the self, towards the flowering of the organization in some political, social, or fiscal way. The questioner had been offered the service of doubting the self and of becoming disheartened over various distortions of the personal nature. This entity had not chosen to use these opportunities, and the Orion entity had basically ceased to be interested in maintaining constant surveillance of this entity. The scribe was under constant surveillance and had been offered numerous opportunities for the intensification of the mental-emotional distortions, and in some cases the connection matrices between mental-emotional complexes and the physical complex counterpart. As this entity had become aware of these attacks, it had become much less pervious to them. This was the particular cause of the great intensification and constancy of the surveillance of the instrument, for it was the weak link due to factors beyond its control within this incarnation. Temptations offered to this group were ignored or rejected. In the case of this particular group, each was given a full range of temptations to cease being of service to each other and to the one infinite Creator. Each entity declined these choices and instead continued with no significant deviations from the desire for a purely other self-service orientation. The power source persisted and indeed improved its inner connections of harmony and love of service. If fourth density temptations, shall we say, towards distortion of ego, etc., were not successful, the fifth density entity then thought in terms of the removal of light. The negative entity hoped to gain a portion of that light. That was the mind-body-spirit complex of the instrument. Barring this, the entity intended to put out the light. At that point, one of the fifth density entities overseeing such detuning processes determined that it would be necessary to terminate the group by what we might call magical means, as we understand ritual magic. There was the potential for the removal of one of this group by such attack, and by far the most vulnerable was the instrument, due to its pre-incarnative physical complex distortions. This is not particularly simple to explain, due to the transdimensional nature, not only of space-time to time-space, but from density to density. The time-space light or fifth density body is used while the space-time fifth density body remains in fifth density. This conscious vehicle attached to the space-time fifth density physical complex is that vehicle which works in this particular service. This was the great virtue of the magical working, whereby consciousness was sent forth essentially without a vehicle, as light. The light would work instantly upon an untuned individual by suggestion. That was the stepping out in front of the traffic, because the suggestion was that there was no traffic. This entity, as each in this group, was enough disciplined in the ways of love and light that it was not suggestible to any great extent. However, there was a predisposition of the physical complex, which this entity was making maximal use of as regards the instrument, hoping, for instance, by means of increasing dizziness, to cause the instrument to fall, or to indeed walk in front of traffic because of impaired vision. This instrument, in the small times of its incarnation, had the distortion in the area of the otic complex of many infections, which caused great difficulties at this small age, as we would call it. The scars of these distortions remained, and indeed that which we call the sinus system remained distorted. Thus, the entity worked with these distortions to produce a loss of the balance and a slight lack of ability to use the optic apparatus. It was fortunate for the ongoing vitality of this contact that the instrument was a strong-willed entity with little tendency towards the distortion, called among our peoples hysteria, since the dizzying effects of this attack had been constant and at times disruptive for several diurnal periods. However, this particular entity was adapting well to the situation, without undue distortions towards fear. Thus the psychic attack was not successful, but did have some draining influence upon the instrument. Occasionally, the fourth density league of companions accompanied the group, while the fifth density friend worked within its own density exclusively. There had been certain avenues into the mind-body-spirit complexes of this group, which had been made available by the group's fifth density friend. The mechanism of the fifth density entity is from density to density and is magical in nature. The fourth density, of itself, is not capable of building the highway into the energy web. However, it is capable of using that which has been left intact. The power source persisted and indeed improved its inner connections of harmony and love of service. The fifth density entity determined that it must attempt the disabling itself. By means of projection, it entered the vicinity of this power source. It assessed the situation. It was bound by the first distortion, but might have taken advantage of any free will distortion. The free will, pre-incarnative distortions of the instrument with regards to the physical vehicle seemed the most promising target. Any distortion away from service to others was also appropriate. When the instrument left its physical vehicle, it did so freely. Thus, the misplacement of the mind-body-spirit complex of the instrument would not be a violation of its free will if it followed the entity freely. This was the process. The positive polarity sees love in all things. Thus, the positive entity follows the negative entity. The negative polarity is clever. The mind-body-spirit complex, which freely leaves the third density physical complex, is vulnerable when the appropriate protection is not at hand. The danger to most in trance state, as we term the physical complex being left, is the touching of the physical complex in such a manner as to attract the mind-body-spirit complex back thereunto, or to damage the means by which that which we call ectoplasm is being recalled. This instrument was an anomaly in that it was well that the instrument not be touched or artificial light thrown upon it while in the trance state. However, the ectoplasmic activity was interiorized. The main difficulty, as you are aware, was then the previously discussed negative removal of the entity under its free will. The unique characteristic which was, shall we say, dangerous was the willing of the mind-body-spirit complex, outward from the physical complex of third density, for the purpose of service to others. In any other situation of unconscious conditions, due to accident or medical anesthetic or drugs, given that the entity was not attempting to be of service, in this particular way which was proceeding then, the entities of negative orientation would not find it possible to remove the mind-body-spirit complex. This can happen only in the trance state is not completely certain, but it is highly probable that in another out-of-body experience, such as death, the entity here examined would, as most positively polarized entities, have a great deal of protection from comrades, guides, and portions of the self, which would be aware of the transfer we call the physical death. In the death experience, no matter what the cause, the negative friends are not likely able to remove an entity. Because the entity without the attachment to the space-time physical complex is far more aware and without the gullibility, which is somewhat the hallmark of those who love wholeheartedly. The uniqueness of this instrument's situation was not the lack of friends, for this, as all entities, had its guides or angelic presences, and due to polarization, teachers and friends also. The unique characteristic of the workings, which the social memory complex Ra and this group had begun, was the intent to serve others, with the highest attempt at near purity which Ra's comrades might have achieved. This had alerted a much more determined friend of negative polarity, which was interested in removing this particular opportunity. The entities of our density, capable of magical defense in this trance state situation, are extremely rare. This was true, when applied almost without exception, to those instruments working in trance, which have not consciously experienced magical training in time-space in the, shall we say, present incarnation. This was also true in the case of this instrument. The plan of the negative entity was to take the mind-body-spirit complex, while it was separated from its yellow body physical complex shell, to then place this mind-body-spirit complex within the negative portions of our time-space. The shell would then become that of the unknowing, unconscious entity and could be, shall we say, worked upon to cause malfunction, which would end in coma and then in what we call the death of the body. At that point, the higher self of the instrument would have the choice of leaving the mind-body-spirit complex in negative time-space, or of allowing incarnation in space-time of equivalent vibration and polarity distortions. Thus, this entity would become a negatively polarized entity, without the advantage of native negative polarization. It would find a long path to the Creator, under these circumstances, although the path would inevitably end well. Each time-space is an analog of a particular sort or vibration of space-time. When a negative time-space is entered by an entity, the next experience will be that of the appropriate negative space-time. This is normally done by the form-making body of a mind-body-spirit complex, which places the entity in the proper time-space for incarnation. The position in negative time-space is that position which is pre-incarnative. After the death of the physical complex in yellow ray activation, the mind-body-spirit complex moves to a far different portion of time-space, in which the indigo body will allow much healing and review to take place, before any movement is made towards another incarnative experience, in case of wanderers, back to home vibration. Time-space is no more homogeneous than space-time. It is as complex and complete a system of illusions, dances, and patterns as is space-time, and has as structured a system of what we may call natural laws. The higher self could allow the mind-body-spirit complex to remain in time-space. However, it is unlikely that the higher self would do so indefinitely, due to its distortion towards the belief that the function of the mind-body-spirit complex is to experience and learn from other selves, thus experiencing the Creator. A highly polarized positive mind-body-spirit complex, surrounded by negative portions of time-space, will experience only darkness, for like the magnet, there is no, shall we say, likeness. Thus a barrier is automatically formed. The strength of the misplaced wanderer's polarization would be matched as far as possible. In some positive sixth density wanderers, the approximation would not quite be complete, due to the paucity of negative sixth density energy fields of the equivalent strength. The positive entity, which incarnates into negative space-time, will not find it possible to maintain any significant positive polarity as negativity, when pure, is a type of gravity, well, shall we say, pulling all into it. Thus the entity, while remembering its learned and preferred polarity, must make use of the catalyst given and recapitulate the lessons of service to self in order to build up enough polarity, in order to cause the potential to occur for reversal. The path back revolves, firstly, about the higher self's reluctance to enter negative time-space. The higher self is reluctant to allow its mind-body-spirit complex to enter negative time-space for the same basic reason an entity of our societal complex would be reluctant to enter a prison. This may be a significant part of the length of that path. Secondly, when a positively oriented entity incarnates in a thoroughly negative environment, it must teach the lessons of the love of self, thus becoming one with its other selves. When this has been accomplished, the entity may then choose to release the potential difference and change polarities. However, the process of learning the accumulated lessons of love of self may be quite lengthy. Let us say that the positively polarized individual makes a poor student of the love of self, and thus spends much more time, if you will, than those native to that pattern of vibrations. Also, the entity, in learning these lessons, may lose much positive orientation during the process, and the choice of reversing polarities may be delayed until the mid-sixth density. All of this is, in our way of measurement, time-consuming, although the end result is well.